Heebie Jeebies have the Heebie Jeebies.
Story from Reddit user Flynn Lives 88. Brother and friends chased by something in the woods. Scotland, summer 2012. So this seems to be the right place to talk about this sort of incident. This happened about 8 years ago now. I am putting the words to paper, so to speak, on behalf of my brother who was there on the night. I can assure you that this is not made up. Hence why I am posting here, because I really want to get some sort of feedback of what my brother experienced, hear from anyone with any ideas of what this is, or have had any similar experiences. My brother and his friends were walking back home through the woods when all they heard was a snap of a branch. When they turned around to look at what it was, they could see the silhouette of a person at the top of a hill, about 100 metres away from where they had just walked down. They watched as it quickly tried to hide behind the tree. My brother and his friends all asked each other if they had just seen that, to which they all replied yes. As they all continued to stare, my brother's eyes finally managed to focus within the difficult lighting as it was night time and dark. He then described that he could see a head peeking from behind the tree, but in an unusual way. It seemed to be tall, and the motion of the head was moving strangely. This is when it got completely terrifying. The thing steps out from the tree and stands at the top of the hill, completely revealing its entire silhouette, almost as if it decides, "I've been seen, I need to do something now" kind of attitude, like a fight or flight attitude. My brother said this is when the overwhelming fear kicked in, because they could all now see that the build of this thing could not be a person. He described it as being tall with a slim waist, gangly but strong limbs, and having your typical alien-shaped head. Long muscular legs accompanied by arms that dangled below the knee. He said he could tell its hands were large, but he could not make out the fingers as it was too dark. It was disproportionate, but when it got to the ribcage, it jutted out again. The creature had your classic big light bulb head, but resting on a slender neck. You could not see clear features or detail as it was too dark, and now to make things even worse, this thing starts to charge down the hill and into the fields surrounded by trees where my brother and his friends are. He said that the pace of the creature was definitely not humanly possible, as it gained a lot of ground very, very quickly. So obviously, my brother and his friends turned tail and began to run for what it felt like their lives. He did not want to turn around and look, as he was completely focused on getting away. My brother said, as they were running, he could hear it stumbling now and again as if it was completely desperate to catch them. He could also hear the footsteps gaining on them, giving him a good idea of how fast this thing was running at. He emphasised on how scary this was, and I can see the terror in his eyes every time he relives that night. As they approach the village, they come to the end of the field where a street lamp glows onto the edge of the field. He said once they got into the light, the creature came to an abrupt stop. It was as if it was scared of the light, or that it did not want to be completely revealed. My brother and his friends kept running until they got home. I've asked my brother's friends about the incident, and they all agree and express how scary it really was. My brother and I love wild camping. Once, the night before the day we were going to go camping, we stupidly began to talk of that night. We ended up not going camping because we creeped each other out so badly that we feared we might see the creature again. I'm ex-military, So as you know, I've done my fair share of sleeping and camping in the woods. That's how scary this is to us. The level of detail and the fear in my brother's face and voice whilst he tells me of the night reinforces the fact that I believe this actually happened. Me telling you here does not do the story justice.
I lived with demons, and I can still see them. Reddit user Nicolette 750.
I lived with demons, and I can see them. I'll explain, but it's a long story. My ex's stepmom was on a supernatural team, and they were cleansing houses, until one day the entities began threatening her, and they said they'd come after her family for interfering with the devil's work. She did one more job, and then her young granddaughter, who didn't yet know how to read or write, couldn't even draw the alphabet yet, had brought her a piece of paper, and she had drawn it 3 consecutive 6s. On the same day, my ex, who was a major Christian and loved his Boy Scout group, quit being both and gave his Bible specifically to her, my young granddaughter. Fast forward about a month or two later, my ex started using all sorts of drugs and got his hands on a satanic Bible. He decided to write a letter denouncing Christianity and that he will not follow God. He signed it with his blood and burnt it over a black candle while reading this Bible. Fast forward to when I move in with him, which was a few months later, and he still kept all the supplies he had, used and lived in the same house. He started becoming furious at the littlest things, like a bad dream, or ran out of drugs. He beat the dog. He even beat me. He screamed at his sister and his mother, and every time he got mad, it ended by him saying, "Make them stop, make the voices stop." And he would punch himself in the head until he bled. He broke his hand doing this numerous times. He even used a brick once. His stepmom and dad were constantly telling him to come over and get prayed, but any talk of religion really bothered him, and he didn't know why. Finally, when I brought it up, he got furious, but that day we had had the worst of luck. I'm talking if anything could break, it did. I'd brought it up again, and this time he'd listened, and so I kept researching it to be sure it wasn't simply a mental illness or paranoia. This one article stood out in particular. It said, if they fall asleep or get tired when you talk about it, they may have demonic oppression, the step before possession. I tried to talk about this with him and told him what I'd found. I kid you not, he almost fell asleep mid-sentence twice, and then I told him about this. As we began to talk about it more deeply, we'd started hearing heavy footsteps and creaking constantly up the stairs when no one else was home. All of my cross necklaces had broken within that week, so we made matching bracelets and engraved faith symbols into them. His broke within 5 minutes of giving him it. I had fixed it, and then it had broken again an hour later when no one had been near it. He got a Christian Bible from a shop when he was younger. He still had this, and his crucifix. He hung both of these above his bed and above our head. He kept the Bible with him. It wasn't long before this was lost as well. He'd started to slack with it, and then he took his crucifix down again. Next time he was mad. He was really mad. And he didn't punch himself this time, but he still hit every object in the room within his reach. Only this time his pupils had completely changed shape. I ran out of the room and left him in a fit of rage. After several hours, he had calmed down. We made up in the early morning, about 3 a.m, and later I started seeing shadows behind me again. Everywhere I looked, they were near us, just the outline of a person. Fast forward 1 week, I came home from work. We had had a fight again, before I'd left that morning, and he was still mad when I returned home. I walked in, and he got up from laying on the couch. The blinds were shut and the lights were off. But what I saw underneath him is forever deeply ingrained into my memory. It looked like how you would imagine an aura might appear, except it was all blurry, like a thick black smoky shadow surrounding him, blacker than anything I'd ever seen before, and you could feel this horrible dark presence in the room. It instilled such terror in me that I couldn't speak. I knew it saw me too. My ex couldn't see this at all. Fast forward later, another month. I saw another person I have yet to identify. I had met him online. By identify, I mean I found someone who did some research on them and had similar experiences to me. We had both came up with some theories together about the tons of shadow people and what looked like a real-life dementor, for a lack of better description. The other one looked more humanoid-like, and the other like an evil beast from hell. When I was young, I opened a gateway and something came through. I was about 15 or 16 years old at the time, growing up in your typical Scottish household. Our house was in the country next to a farm. It was a very nice place to grow up. I have an older brother who I've always been very close with. He was about 17 at the time. We were two peas in a pod. My brother seemed to have a keen interest in the existence of ghosts and the spirit world from a very young age. He always had strange things happen to him growing up. One day we had got into quite a comical argument about the existence of the subject of ghosts. We debated it out and could not come to an agreement. My brother thought hard about how he could convince me and presented me with the idea to try a spirit board, also known as a Ouija board. He drew up his best imitation of a spirit board, based on very limited knowledge at the time. There was no hello or goodbye written on the board. In other words, we had no way of ending the interaction once it had begun. We used a 2-pence piece as a planchette, and we both promised that we'd not fake anything, as we both genuinely wanted to know the truth and if it would actually work. And work it most certainly did. We both placed our index fingers lightly on the planchette and began moving it around the board in a counterclockwise rotation to warm the board up as advised. We then moved it to the centre again, and my brother began to open the dialogue. "Is there anyone here who would like to communicate?" he asked. Literally as soon as he finished his sentence, the planchette began moving strongly. It pointed to the word yes. I don't think any of us were taking it seriously at this point. We began to ask more detailed questions like, what is your name? How old are you? Did you live here? We didn't receive any answer for anything else. My brother continued to the next question. He was hesitant to ask this one. Are you good or bad? Very quickly the planchette began to slide around the board. We watched carefully. The fear was beginning to build now as we watched the board quite quickly spell out the word E-V-I-L, evil. We both looked at each other in shock, and I quickly pulled my hand away from the board. "You weren't supposed to do that," my brother said, with a look of terror on his face. "You're supposed to say goodbye before you take your finger away." We quickly searched for some ways to see how serious the situation was. We were told that we had most likely opened a gateway to the other side, and now it will stay open. We were hopeless in what to do. We tried our best to carry on as normal and put the thought to the back of our minds. Later that night, my family all went to bed. My brother and I went to our separate rooms and settled down for the night, and we all fell asleep as normal. I was woken abruptly, however, because my brother had also woken up, except he was screaming loudly. I heard banging and commotion coming from his room. I was scared. I'd looked down at my alarm clock, and I'd noticed it was just after 3 a.m. in the morning. My mother quickly ran up the stairs to see what was going on. She went into his room and calmed him down. Afterwards, she came to my room and reassured me that my brother had only had a night terror. Night terror is a phenomena that can occur when you wake up from a dream, but you're still partially seeing parts of the nightmare as you are awake. I calmed myself down and went back to sleep. The next morning, I went through to my brother's room to see if he was okay. I noticed he had pulled the curtains from the wall, and he had clearly not went back to sleep after his so-called night terror. I asked him if he was okay and asked him what had happened. What he said will never ever leave me till this day. He said, "I woke up last night, or in the early hours of the morning, because I heard a very strange noise in my room. It sounded like rapid pitter-patter on the floor, travelling around my bed from one ear to the other. I was shocked at first, so was hesitant to open my eyes. When I did work up the courage to open them and take a look, the noise stopped immediately, just as I was opening them. His voice had started to tremble now. It was almost as if he was going to start crying. He was shaky, as if full of adrenaline and anxiety. He continued, "When I opened my eyes, the noise stopped and there was something standing next to my bed, leaning over my face threateningly and looking me directly in the eyes. He said, he looked human, but not quite right. He was horribly pale, dressed in rags. He had ghostly white skin, sunken black eye sockets with pure white eyes that almost seemed to glow in the darkness. He stared at me with a menacing grin, and that's when I noticed his teeth were not like those of a human. They were like fangs, but instead of being packed neatly together, they were spread out with large spaces in between. He looked like he wanted to hurt me," he said. My first reaction, besides screaming in terror, was to strike out and kick it. I kicked it twice, and it did not react to it. My foot went straight through it both times, and it just continued to stare me in the eyes. So I recoiled and dived off the bed. I crawled over to the corner there and pulled the blinds off the wall. As the street light came in the window and lit up the room with an orange glow, the thing then disappeared and Mum came bursting in the door. I was absolutely shocked to my core when my brother told me about all this. From that point on, the house was never the same again. It was full of poltergeist activity, from the voices and breathing from within the walls, to the banging, thumping and throwing of objects, to the angry voices in my television and all the shadows that walk in this house, that all of my friends were scared to visit. I can honestly say I am happy we do not live here anymore, but I also feel bad for the next people who will. These walls have eyes and a forked tongue.